What if evil didn't look cruel? What if it smiled at you, kind, polite, helpful, wearing the perfect mask of goodness? And what if the people you trust the most are exactly the ones you should fear? This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's philosophy. Nietzsche warned that those who claim to be good may just be nursing resentment. Arendt showed that history's worst horrors often came from obedient, upstanding folks. Jung taught us that anyone who identifies only with the light is hiding their own shadow. Kindness, when used as a shield, stops being a virtue and becomes a weapon. In this video, you'll encounter 25 philosophical insights revealing why good people can actually be the ones you need to watch out for. We're not talking about overt evil, but something far more common and far more insidious. Morality as performance, empathy as manipulation. Doing good as a tool of control. Get ready. After this video, you'll think twice before trusting anyone, especially those who seem too good to be true. Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher of Jewish descent, is behind one of the most disturbing ideas in modern political thought, the banality of evil. This concept came from her experience reporting on the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, which she later explored in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Eichmann was a Nazi officer responsible for organizing the deportation of millions of Jews to concentration camps during the Holocaust. But what shocked Arendt in the courtroom wasn't a sadistic monster or a fanatical ideologue. It was how normal Eichmann seemed. He wasn't full of hatred or cruelty. He claimed he was just following orders. This disturbing normality is what led Arendt to her central idea that in the modern world, evil can be committed by completely ordinary people, not out of hatred, but out of obedience, conformity, and the inability to think for themselves. Arendt wasn't saying evil is trivial. On the contrary, she showed how deep and dangerous it is that regular people can participate in horrific acts without even realizing the weight of their actions. The greatest evil in the world is committed by people who do not choose to be either good or evil, she wrote. It's this moral passivity, this lack of critical judgment, that allows institutional evil to spread. This wasn't just historical analysis, it was a warning about the modern world. In bureaucratic systems, where duties are divided and responsibilities are passed along the chain of command, people stop feeling personally accountable. They do tasks, follow procedures, fill out forms, but don't consider how their actions affect real human beings. According to Arendt, Eichmann wasn't a monster. He was a man who failed to think. And by thinking, she didn't just mean logic or intelligence. She meant moral reflection. She described him as terribly normal, a living example of what happens when people give up their inner voice in exchange for order and discipline. That's what makes her insight so uncomfortable. It destroys the comforting belief that only bad people do bad things. Arendt showed that evil can hide in routine, in obedience, in silence. Evil doesn't always need hate. It grows in places where people stop asking questions. That's why the concept of the banality of evil is so important today. Our modern world is still deeply bureaucratic. Laws, rules, and policies are everywhere. But when these tools are used to justify injustice, what stops us from becoming accomplices, just like Eichmann? Arendt wasn't demonizing people. She didn't make Eichmann into a symbol of pure evil. Instead, she forced us to face a painful truth. Under certain conditions, anyone can become part of a destructive system and not even realize it. And that's her ethical warning. Evil often doesn't come from hatred, but from a lack of reflection. People who would never hurt others directly might still be complicit, simply by obeying orders or avoiding responsibility. Arendt's lesson is hard, but essential. Being good in the usual sense isn't enough. It's not enough to follow the rules, obey the law, or be seen as respectable. Real goodness demands constant awareness, ethical judgment, and the courage to go against the grain when human dignity is on the line. In Eichmann's case, the horror of the Holocaust wasn't only caused by twisted ideologies, it was enabled by the daily cooperation of countless people who were just doing their jobs. And that realization might be the most chilling truth of the 20th century. Arendt also believed that thinking is an ethical act, not just intellectual activity, but a form of moral resistance. To think is to question, and to question is to be capable of saying no. Eichmann failed because he stopped asking the basic, human questions. Is this right? Is this just? Is this human? When we stop reflecting, we create the perfect environment for authoritarianism, oppression, and systemic injustice to take hold, with the help of people who, individually, would never commit harm, but who collectively become part of a cruel machine. So the banality of evil isn't about labeling villains. It's about recognizing how systems turn people into moral bystanders. It's about understanding how obedience replaces thought, and how that silence opens the door to evil. Arendt believed that ethical responsibility can't be outsourced. Each person must be able to think, to judge, to resist, even when it goes against authority, the majority, or the rules. She didn't offer easy answers, but she gave us a clear principle. Wherever obedience replaces conscience, evil finds a way in, and wherever thinking is silenced, ethics disappears. Friedrich Nietzsche dared to ask a question that few had the courage to raise. What if the morality of the good isn't actually that good? What if, behind all the talk of kindness, humility, and compassion, there's something darker, like the will to dominate, resentment, or a hunger for control? That's the heart of one of Nietzsche's most powerful critiques. Traditional morality, especially Christian and bourgeois morality, doesn't come from virtue, but from weakness. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche argues that morality was created as a strategy, a power play by the weak to gain control over the strong. He breaks it down into two kinds of morality: master morality and slave morality. Master morality comes from strength. It's the worldview of people who feel empowered, who create their own values, and who say yes to life, to risk, to vitality, to greatness. For them, good is everything that reflects strength, courage, abundance, and creativity. Bad is anything weak, small, pitiful, things they simply look down on. Slave morality, on the other hand, comes from resentment. It's the mindset of those who can't express power directly, people who suffer, and instead of confronting that pain, turn it into a virtue. Instead of saying yes to life, they say no to others. For the slave, goodness isn't strength, it's humility. It's not independence, it's obedience. It's not power, it's self-sacrifice. Evil becomes anything proud, bold, or free. In this way, slave morality flips the values of the strong on their head. And for Nietzsche, this is revenge, disguised as virtue. He called this the revaluation of values. And here's where his critique gets even sharper. Moralism, for Nietzsche, isn't about purity or truth. It's about strategy. It turns weakness into a moral standard. It tears others down in the name of goodness. It uses compassion as a tool for guilt. It turns suffering into symbolic power. In his view, the morality of the good, the kind, the humble, the just, isn't driven by love, but by self-hate and envy of the strong. It's the morality of the resentful, people who can't build their own lives, so they spend their energy judging the lives of others. Nietzsche knew that resentment is creative. It invents values, but they're negative values, ones that shrink desire, suppress uniqueness, and feed guilt and shame. It's a morality that looks like love, but deep down, it's fear. It's goodness used as a way to punish. Where do we see this today? When someone condemns others' pleasure in the name of morality, when people call themselves good citizens just to shame others, when political correctness is used not to include, but to silence, when cancel culture masks a thirst for punishment as if it were justice. Nietzsche wasn't attacking ethics itself. He was attacking ethics born from fear, envy, and denial of life. He wanted a morality that affirms, not represses, that frees, not controls. That's why he called for a rethinking of all values. And he introduced the idea of the Übermensch, not a superior human being, but someone who creates their own values, who refuses to follow the herd, who lives with courage and takes full responsibility for their existence. This Übermensch isn't moralistic. He's ethical in the deepest sense. He finds his own meaning in life. He doesn't need to judge others. He transforms himself. Nietzsche believed a society's moral health could be measured by its ability to create new values. But a society stuck in resentment, guilt, and punishment is one in decline. A society where the good use morality to dominate others is a sick society. And this is the key to his critique. When morality becomes a weapon, it turns into tyranny. When we use goodness as a form of control, we lose ethics and enter the realm of power games. Nietzsche urges us to look inward and ask, is my outrage truly just? Or is it just jealousy in disguise? Is my kindness real? Or is it resentment pretending to be moral? Do I genuinely want what's right? Or do I just want to punish those who are different from me? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary. Because as long as we believe we're the good ones, just because we follow inherited moral rules, we're living in denial. Nietzsche challenges us to go beyond borrowed morality and to build a living, breathing ethics rooted in the power of existence, not the urge to condemn. Ultimately, what he's offering is freedom, but it's a freedom that comes with a price. It demands self-awareness, courage to leave the herd, and the willingness to confront your own fear. It means dropping the mask of being good so you can finally live with truth. When we hear the name Machiavelli, most people think of the phrase, "the ends justify the means," even though he never actually wrote those exact words. Still, the core of his thinking is deeply unsettling for anyone who believes that power can be exercised purely. Machiavelli forces us to see politics as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. And in doing so, he casts a suspicious eye on kindness, especially when it's displayed by rulers. For him, being good isn't always the same as being just. And kindness, when used as a political tool, can be just as strategic as the use of force. In his most famous work, The Prince, written in 1513, Machiavelli bluntly states, "A prince must learn how to use both the beast and the man." He's referring to the ruler who, if he wants to hold on to power and maintain order, must know when to act with compassion and when to act with cunning or even violence. In other words, a good ruler isn't someone who's always kind, but someone who knows when to appear kind and when to abandon that appearance if it becomes dangerous. To Machiavelli, power cannot be maintained by relying solely on traditional moral virtues like honesty, generosity, and mercy. He argues that these virtues, when applied too rigidly, can make a leader vulnerable. A ruler who is too generous might bankrupt the state. One who's too forgiving might encourage lawlessness. That's why he famously wrote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both." This doesn't mean Machiavelli supports cruelty for cruelty's sake, but he does warn us. Politics demands hard decisions, and more importantly, it requires the wisdom to understand that public morality and private morality follow different rules. What is considered good on a personal level, like forgiveness, trust, or transparency, can lead to disaster when applied literally in government. And this is exactly why Machiavelli advises rulers to manipulate the image of kindness. In his words, "It is necessary to appear merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, and religious, and to actually be so. But one must also be prepared not to be so when necessary." This is the heart of Machiavelli's suspicion of kindness, the recognition that the image of a good ruler can be used strategically, even if behind the scenes, cold, cruel, or unpopular decisions are being made. Kindness becomes a tool, not an absolute virtue. In Machiavelli's view, real politics requires separating what is morally desirable from what is effective. The political virtue he calls virtù is not the same as religious or philosophical virtue. Virtue is the ability to act boldly, wisely, and opportunistically. It means doing what must be done to maintain stability, even if it clashes with traditional moral values. This view breaks away from centuries of moral philosophy that tied leadership to divine justice, charity, or purity. Machiavelli pulls politics down from the clouds of idealism and plants it firmly in the dirt of reality. And that changes everything. He argues that those in power must understand that others, the people, opponents, even allies, often judge more by appearances than by actual actions. So, the appearance of goodness can be more useful than real goodness. Most people value stability, order, and security. And if a leader seems good, that can be enough to maintain public approval, even if manipulation and calculation lie behind that appearance. This kind of moral realism, often mistaken for cynicism, is actually a brutal form of clarity. Machiavelli isn't asking rulers to be monsters. He's asking them to be prepared for a world where kindness is fragile and blind trust can be fatal. That doesn't mean he rejects morality. On the contrary, he knows morality has power and that it can be used as a political tool. A ruler who appears moral gains legitimacy. But if he's naive enough to believe that everyone around him is also acting morally, he risks being betrayed, deceived, and destroyed. This awareness is what makes his philosophy both powerful and uncomfortable. Machiavelli teaches that in politics, moralism can be a mask for ambition, weakness, or even revenge. Leaders who preach too much virtue might just be hiding their inability to act decisively, or they may be using morality as a weapon to discredit their enemies. How many times in history, and even today, have we seen politicians accuse their opponents of being immoral while hiding their own failures? Political kindness is often just rhetoric, a facade, a marketing tool. And Machiavelli forces us to ask, are we witnessing real virtue, or just the mask that power has chosen to wear? In the end, Machiavelli's philosophy invites us to be skeptical, to look beyond the speeches, to realize that the game of power often uses the language of morality to justify actions that, in any other setting, would be unthinkable. Machiavelli's suspicion of kindness is not a rejection of humanity. It's a form of lucidity. It's understanding that beyond the noble words, there is a battleground of strength, stability, and influence. And those who don't grasp this might be destroyed by those who do. Carl Jung gave us one of the most unsettling ideas in deep psychology. The evil we deny in ourselves doesn't disappear. It hides. And the more someone identifies with the image of being a good person, the more danger they face in ignoring what Jung called the shadow. For Jung, the shadow is an inseparable part of the human psyche. It's everything we don't want to be, everything we reject in ourselves: selfish desires, anger, envy, greed, arrogance, cruelty. In short, everything that doesn't match the image we create of ourselves as civilized, moral, or virtuous. The problem is, what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves doesn't cease to exist. It just goes underground. It becomes unconscious. And that's what makes it dangerous. The shadow, according to Jung, isn't evil in itself. It's our personal, unconscious, repressed. It gains power precisely because it's rejected. And when it's not integrated, it can show up in destructive ways. Emotional outbursts, hypocritical behavior, projecting onto others, or even acts of cruelty disguised as good intentions. That's why Jung gives a timeless warning. The person who sees themselves as too good is at risk of being controlled by their own shadow. The more someone builds a persona, a social mask, based on kindness, generosity, or virtue, the stronger the internal pressure becomes from the parts of themselves they're trying to suppress. The person believes they're always fair, always right, always ethical, but in practice, they might act rigidly, controlling, or intolerantly. In many cases, the shadow sneaks into the very actions meant to be good. A clear example is the person who obsessively helps others, but deep down, it's really about control, superiority, or hiding their own guilt. Or someone who harshly condemns others' mistakes while ignoring their own destructive impulses. Jung called this projecting the shadow. By not recognizing the darkness within, a person starts to see it only in others, and that's the danger. Over-identifying with goodness can be a way to avoid the truth about who we really are. The shadow, as a psychological force, isn't inherently bad. It also contains vitality, creativity, instinct, power. But when it's repressed, it can turn against us. Jung didn't suggest we eliminate the shadow. That would just be another form of denial. What he proposed was integration, a deep process of recognizing, accepting, and giving conscious space to what's within us, even if it's uncomfortable. In his words, "He who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens." Looking inward means having the courage to face our less noble impulses, without justifying them, but also without denying them. It's the path of individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole person. Without it, kindness becomes a mask, and like all masks, it eventually wears out, falls off, and reveals what it was trying to hide. It's common to see people who present themselves as moral examples, religious, politically correct, defenders of justice, and then show abusive, intolerant, or manipulative behavior. That's no coincidence. It's often the result of an unacknowledged shadow. Jung warned, "The brighter the light, the darker the shadow." The evil we refuse to confront within tends to spill out into the world, often in the name of noble causes. This happens not just with individuals, but with groups too. Social movements, religious communities, or political factions that see themselves as morally flawless often act violently against those they label as bad. That's also collective shadow. For Jung, self-knowledge is the only truly ethical path. It's not enough to want to be good. You have to know yourself. You have to understand that we are ambiguous, contradictory, complex beings, that each of us holds both light and darkness, that good and evil aren't absolute opposites, they're intertwined inner forces. This psychological realism is deep and freeing. It protects us from falling into the trap of moral superiority. And it reminds us that real ethical work isn't just about visible behavior. It's about digging inside, confronting our wounds, weaknesses, anger, and hidden desires. The shadow path requires humility. It takes courage to say, "I can also be guilty of the things I criticize in others." But that awareness doesn't destroy us. On the contrary, it humanizes us. A person who integrates their shadow doesn't have to be perfect. They make mistakes, but they own them. They have impulses, but they don't lie to themselves. They don't need to appear good. They try to be whole. And that wholeness is far more transformative than any idealized image. Jung also saw this process as deeply spiritual. For him, individuation, meeting your true self, is a sacred path. Not in a religious sense, but in an archetypal, symbolic one. Looking into the shadow is entering the cave where the dragon lives, but also where the treasure is hidden. That's why Jung's message still resonates. Beware of perfect goodness. It might be hiding fear, moral narcissism, or an unconscious desire to control. And above all, it might block real inner transformation. Only someone who knows their own darkness can act with true light. Everything else is just a mask. Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian contemporary philosopher, is known for his provocative style, his unusual mix of Lacanian psychoanalysis and Hegelian philosophy, and his sharp critique of today's ideological culture. But maybe one of his most powerful and uncomfortable ideas is this: goodness can be a form of control. In other words, good intentions can sometimes support the worst kinds of oppression. What appears to be ethical, humanitarian, or morally high-minded often ends up covering up systems of domination, inequality, and structural violence. Zizek invites us to be suspicious not just of obvious evil, but of hidden goodness, the kind that disguises itself as compassion, charity, or justice, but ultimately works to protect the dominant ideology. His critique starts with a fundamental reversal. It's not obvious cruelty that keeps power systems going today. It's the appearance of kindness. Billionaire philanthropy is one of his favorite examples. When tech moguls or finance giants donate millions to social causes, it looks like generosity. But Zizek asks, what if that charity is just a way to keep the system, the one they benefit from, in place? In that sense, goodness doesn't change anything. It just soothes the conscience and softens the impact of a system that keeps doing harm without ever questioning the root causes. Charity becomes useful to the system. It heals what capitalism itself continues to wound. And that's why he says, the worst kind of slave is the one who loves their slavery. This radical statement gets to the heart of his critique. Real ideology doesn't force, it seduces. It presents itself as kindness, as choice, as freedom. But all of this can be shaped by an invisible symbolic structure, and that makes it even more powerful. Zizek argues that the language of tolerance, diversity, and inclusion, while important, can also be hijacked by systems that don't actually want real change. Global capitalism loves to promote a moral image. Companies support social causes, launch empathy-driven ad campaigns, post slogans about equality. But he asks, what kind of equality is this if it's satisfied with surface-level representation and never touches the deeper economic structures that continue to exploit people? Zizek points out that this human-faced capitalism is actually a more effective version of domination, because it numbs criticism, creates an illusion of progress, and protects the core of the system. That's one of ideology's trademarks. According to him, it doesn't just tell you what to think. It shapes what you think is even possible to think. When doing good becomes the cultural consensus, any criticism of it seems absurd, ungrateful, or even dangerous. And that's exactly where Zizek steps in, to remind us that the most powerful forms of control don't come from censorship. They come from internalized morality. We're taught to accept suffering as long as it's framed as morally justified. It's for the good of society. It's to ensure safety. It's to protect the vulnerable. But Zizek asks, what if suffering isn't a flaw in the system, but part of how it actually works? A clear example is what he calls systemic violence, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but happens silently every day through inequality, exclusion, poverty. While mainstream morality points fingers at individual violent acts, the bad people, it distracts us from the violence built into the normal way the world works. In this case, ideology doesn't deny evil. It normalizes it through rules, laws, contracts. And yes, good intentions. That's why Zizek's critique matters today, because he challenges the narratives that make us feel the most comfortable. He forces us to ask, who benefits from this kind of goodness? Who profits from the dominant morality? Who's being silenced in the name of civility, order, and empathy? Zizek also brings psychoanalysis into this. With Lacan, he argues that our relationship with goodness is often shaped by an unconscious desire to maintain a comfortable symbolic structure. We want to do good, but deep down, we don't want to pay the price of real transformation. Real change would mean breaking away from the system, our habits, and our positions of privilege. That's why he provokes us with lines like, sometimes, doing good is the best way to avoid the real. In other words, the real problem, inequality, oppression, structural suffering, gets hidden under layers of good deeds, politically correct language, and shallow moral gestures. Zizek's critique isn't against goodness itself. It's against the ideological use of goodness. It's against morality that blocks real change. It's against empathy that hides a fear of real conflict. It's against compassion that quiets down justified anger. That's why he pushes us to ask, what is the cost of the goodness we defend? Are we fighting for justice, or just putting a prettier face on injustice? Maybe real goodness starts when we stop seeking moral comfort and start facing the uncomfortable conflicts we avoid, when we stop using goodness as a shield and start using it as a challenge. For Zizek, philosophy isn't here to make us feel better. It's here to make us uncomfortable. And sometimes, the first step toward freedom is learning to doubt goodness. The word kindness usually brings to mind compassion, altruism, and justice. But what if, under certain conditions, kindness stops being a human virtue and becomes part of a senseless machine? What if, instead of freeing us, kindness helps keep people submissive in the face of a cold, impersonal authority? That's one of the unsettling questions that runs through Franz Kafka's work. In novels like The Trial and The Castle, and short stories like In the Penal Colony, Kafka builds worlds where good and evil are blurry, and where kindness itself can be used as a tool of institutional control. Kafka's characters often try to do what's right. They obey, cooperate, and try to be helpful. They're generally docile. They don't rebel outright. But instead of being rewarded, they're pulled into opaque maze-like systems that judge, punish, or simply ignore them. In these stories, kindness doesn't offer protection. It becomes a trap. Take Joseph K., the protagonist of The Trial. He's an ordinary working man who wakes up one day to find out he's under arrest. He doesn't know why, doesn't know who's accusing him, and isn't allowed to understand the court's rules. Still, he tries to cooperate. Instead of fighting back, he tries to understand. He tries to be polite. He tries to be good. But the system doesn't respond to his good intentions. On the contrary, the more he tries to play along, the deeper he gets stuck, the more control he loses over his own life. Kafka is making a deep point here. In some systems, kindness isn't just useless. It actually helps the system function. A person's docility doesn't save them. In fact, it makes them more vulnerable. Obedience isn't seen as virtue. It's seen as weakness. The desire to cooperate doesn't lead to solutions. It leads to paralysis. And in the end, the story ends with Joseph K.'s absurd death, unexplained, unjust, and meaningless. Kafka shows us that institutions can be not just cruel, but indifferent. And it's this indifference that makes everything more disturbing. There's no clear villain, no face to confront. The system is abstract, faceless, and yet unstoppable. And that's exactly why the attempt to be good, to follow rules, to hope for recognition, becomes useless. This same structure appears in The Castle, where the protagonist, also named K, tries to gain access to a mysterious, unreachable authority to legitimize his presence in a village. He follows all the rules, talks to local bureaucrats, gets caught in endless procedures. But the more effort he puts in, the more lost he becomes. The castle, the seat of power, never welcomes him, never acknowledges him, never gives a straight answer. Everything stays unresolved, and perhaps the most disturbing part, no one else seems to find it strange. The local people accept this absurd system as normal. They believe in the rules, defend the structure, and often justify its failures with moral arguments. They're doing the best they can, or there must be a higher purpose. Here, Kafka shows us that kindness can also be collective and complicit. People keep believing in the legitimacy of institutions that oppress them, justifying abuses with phrases like, "they mean well," or "we must follow the rules." This Kafkaesque dynamic is deeply existential. The individual searches for meaning, justice, and clarity. But all they find is ambiguity, silence, and fragmentation. And the more they try to live up to some ideal of good behavior, the more the system shuts them out. Kindness, in this context, is not a virtue. It's an illusion, a hope that paralyzes. That's why Kafka's work is so disturbing. He doesn't show us a world full of obvious evil where a hero fights a clear villain. He shows us a world where evil is structural, quiet, and disguised as normal life. A world where individual goodness is absorbed by institutions that don't reward it. They just use it as fuel. And maybe that's the most chilling part. Kafka's logic is still alive today. We see people trying to be good citizens, good employees, good students, hoping for recognition from systems that are often indifferent or even hostile. People who follow every rule and still get stuck in pointless bureaucracy, unfair decisions, and arbitrary systems. People who suffer in silence because they believe their kindness will be noticed and that someday justice will come. Kafka forces us to ask, what if that justice never comes? What if the system never answers? What if it survives because of our moral expectations? At this point, Kafka's critique goes beyond politics. It hits something existential. Because the problem isn't just the system, it's our relationship with the system. It's our faith in the idea that being good is enough, that following the rules will protect us, that seeking recognition is fair. Kafka tears that faith apart, and in its place, he leaves us with emptiness, not despair, but clarity. The clarity to see that kindness, without critical awareness, might just be another cog in the machine. Maybe in Kafka's worlds, and in ours, the truly ethical act isn't obedience, but lucidity, not aligning with institutional goodness, but realizing when goodness has become a trap. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, spent much of his life exploring the hidden motivations behind human behavior. And one of his most uncomfortable discoveries was this: we're not always good for purely noble reasons. In many cases, kindness can be, without us realizing it, a form of psychological defense. In other words, morality can be unconscious, and more than that, it can be a response to internal conflict, repressed anxiety, and unacknowledged desires. Freud was one of the first to challenge the idea that we're fully aware of why we do what we do. He believed the human mind is divided into three parts: the id, which holds our most primitive and instinctive urges, the ego, which tries to deal with reality, and the superego, which represents internalized moral standards, often inherited from culture, religion, and our parents. It's within this structure that kindness can emerge as a defense mechanism. One of the key ways this happens is through what Freud called reaction formation. Reaction formation is a defense mechanism where someone represses an unacceptable desire and unconsciously overcompensates by acting in the exact opposite way, often in an exaggerated, virtuous manner. For example, a person with deep-seated anger might become overly sweet, or someone with repressed sexual urges might turn into a strict moralist. What looks like kindness might actually be a psychic tactic to avoid guilt, anxiety, or the fear of being rejected. And here's the unsettling part: the person isn't pretending to be good. They truly believe they are. But that belief is driven by unconscious conflict. So in this context, kindness isn't less real, but it's more complicated. It's not a free, conscious choice. It's a response shaped by inattention. Freud didn't judge this ambiguity. He exposed it. His goal wasn't to destroy morality, but to uncover its hidden roots, so we could act with more awareness and less illusion. Another important psychic process Freud explored was sublimation. For him, sublimation was one of the most advanced ways of dealing with unacceptable desires. Instead of repressing them, the person redirects those urges into socially valuable activities. A classic example would be an artist turning suffering and aggression into powerful artwork, or a doctor transforming a need for control into care and service. In this case, kindness is also a transformation, but not a denial. Sublimation doesn't suppress, it channels. It's a healthier, more mature form of moral expression, but it still carries the energy of human desire. However, not all kindness is sublimation. In many cases, what seems like generosity is actually an unconscious attempt to manage guilt from childhood, a need for approval, or a fear of punishment. Freud noticed that people who are excessively altruistic, Those who always put others first, who can't say no, who live to please, are often trying to make up for feelings of inadequacy, resentment, or a desperate need to be loved. That kind of kindness, even though society admires it, can be a denial of the self, and that's why it leads to suffering. These people often end up feeling invisible, blaming themselves for having normal desires, and becoming frustrated when their good deeds don't get the recognition they hoped for. Freud invites us to look inward and ask ourselves, what am I trying to avoid with this kindness? What would happen if I stopped trying to please everyone? What unconscious guilt is driving me? These questions aren't comfortable, but they're freeing. Freud understood that human culture requires some repression. We can't just act on every impulse. But he also warned that too much repression creates neurosis, hypocrisy, and deep emotional pain. That's where his critique of rigid morality comes in. It can create people who are overly controlled, unhappy, and disconnected from their own complexity. That's why, in The Future of an Illusion, Freud wrote that traditional religious morality often fuels a punishing superego, one that paralyzes people with guilt. In that case, the person isn't ethical because they chose to be, but because they're afraid of punishment. Their kindness is fear disguised as virtue, and that changes everything. For Freud, real ethics only begin when a person confronts their desires, faces their own shadow, and accepts their contradictions. When they stop trying to be good at all costs and start being honest with themselves. That honesty doesn't destroy morality, it transforms it. It makes morality less like a suit of armor and more like a conscious chosen path. In therapy, Freud saw this all the time. Patients slowly letting go of their idealized self-image, of compulsively being good, and beginning to reclaim who they really were. Anger came up, desire appeared, but so did freedom. The freedom to love without guilt, to say yes with clarity and no with truth. So when kindness is just a defense mechanism, it's fragile, unstable, and full of pain. But when it comes from self-knowledge, it becomes real, not perfect, not idealized, but human. Freud left us with a legacy that goes far beyond clinical work. The courage to ask, why do I really do what I do? And maybe the most important lesson is this: to truly be good, you first have to be honest with yourself. Albert Camus, the French-Algerian philosopher, rejected both despair and the promise of total salvation. His thinking was born from the open wound of the 20th century, a century where, in the name of supposedly noble ideals, millions of lives were destroyed. And it was exactly against that kind of thinking that Camus built his ethical stance, a radical refusal of absolute goodness. In The Rebel, a central work in his moral philosophy, Camus explores the tragic path of human revolt. The person who rebels, he says, does so in the name of dignity. By saying there's a line that must not be crossed, the rebel affirms something worth defending: freedom, life, justice. That, for Camus, is where ethics begins. But there's a hidden danger in that movement. When revolt becomes ideology, it stops protecting life and starts justifying it. Camus shows how, historically, rebellion can turn into tyranny when people start sacrificing others for some absolute ideal or greater good. And that's where his most powerful warning comes in. We begin by killing in the name of justice and end up killing in the name of absolute truth. This sentence captures a tragic pattern. In the name of doing good, evil is committed. History is full of these examples. Revolutions that promised freedom and delivered terror. Religions that preached love and carried out persecution. Governments that claimed to protect people and ended up imprisoning them. For Camus, the problem lies in moral absolutism. The belief that there's an idea so pure, so noble, so unquestionable, that any sacrifice is justified in its name. This belief turns real human beings, with their flaws, pain, and complexity, into mere tools to serve an ideal. That's what Camus rejects. with full force. Instead, he offers what he calls an ethics of lucidity, an ethic that doesn't rely on eternal truths or promises of ultimate redemption, but is grounded in the clear awareness that no idea is worth more than a single life. For Camus, lucidity is the courage to see the world as it truly is, absurd, imperfect, fragile, and still refuse to betray human dignity. You see this in his novel The Plague, where the city of Iran is overtaken by a deadly epidemic. The characters don't fight it with heroic speeches or grand gestures, but through quiet, imperfect, human actions. They know they can't save the world, but they also know they can't abandon one another. The book's protagonist, Dr. Ryu, says, "The only way to fight the plague is with honesty." And when someone asks him what honesty means, he replies, "Doing my job." That simple, grounded response sums up Camus' idea of moral responsibility, acting without illusions, without fanaticism, without needing recognition. Acting because someone's life matters right now in front of you, not because of some future reward or abstract ideal. Camus's ethics of lucidity is a rejection of both nihilism and absolute idealism. The nihilist says, nothing matters, so anything goes. The idealist says, everything matters, so any sacrifice is allowed. Camus stands in the middle. The world is absurd, and still, life has value. And that tension is exactly where real morality must begin. Not from certainty, but from loyalty to what's human. His philosophy is both tragic and deeply compassionate. Tragic because it admits there are no perfect answers, that suffering is inevitable and death is certain. Compassionate because, despite or because of all that, it calls us to act with care, limits, and respect for others. Camus also sharply criticized fanaticism in all forms. A fanatic is someone who believes they're absolutely right and who uses that belief to justify anything. It's someone who puts ideas above people, the future above the present, purity above compassion. Against that, Camus defends restraint, humility, and the recognition that we're all fallible. And because of that, we must always question the power we claim in the name of doing good. This tragic humility is the heart of his ethics, and it's what leads him to reject grand moral narratives, bloody causes, and systems that promise salvation but ignore real suffering. Maybe that's why Camus' philosophy still feels so relevant. We live in a time where public morality is often used to justify exclusion, war, punishment, and division, where goodness is invoked to defend borders, enforce order, uphold faith, or push progress. And Camus asks, who's being sacrificed for this idea? Who's paying the price for your purity? His message is clear. Real goodness is the kind that refuses to sacrifice others, even for a noble cause. And lucidity is the daily effort to remember that, even when it would be easier to look away. Camus didn't want us to save the world. He wanted us to resist the temptation to destroy it in the name of an idea, because in the end, the only revolution worth believing in is the one that refuses to kill in the name of good. For Plato, morality isn't about opinion, social convention, or how things look. It's about truth, and that's exactly what makes it so difficult. Because in the world we live in, the appearance of goodness often takes the place of true goodness. And that substitution is more dangerous than it seems. In the Republic, Plato tackles one of the most important questions in moral philosophy. Why be just? To answer it, he makes a critical distinction: the difference between seeming just and being just, between showing off virtues in public and actually having a soul that is whole, balanced, and truly oriented toward good. This distinction is essential. Plato saw, with striking clarity, that morality can be faked, that the most unjust people can speak the language of justice, that the corrupt can present themselves as defenders of the law, that tyrants can disguise themselves as saviors. He lays this out through the figure of the perfectly unjust man, someone who knows how to appear just in every way, earn people's trust, and control public perception, while secretly acting out of greed, ambition, and a thirst for power. This person is the opposite of the perfectly just man, someone who chooses what is right even when it brings suffering, damages his reputation, or even leads to death. In many ways, Plato is foreshadowing Socrates here, who was condemned unjustly for seeming corrupt, even though he was genuinely pursuing moral truth. For Plato, this reveals the core problem. Society often values the appearance of virtue more than virtue itself. Because of that, institutions can be taken over by sophists, false wise men, and politicians who know how to win over the crowd, but have no real connection to truth. In the dialogue Gorgias, Plato pushes this critique even further. He portrays rhetoric, the art of persuasion, as a form of power that can be used to distort truth and manipulate perception. A skilled speaker can convince a crowd that wrong is right and right is wrong. For Plato, this is a serious moral risk because moral judgment becomes shallow, based on what's seen, not what is. Moral deception, then, isn't just an ethical mistake. It's a threat to the very foundation of a just society, a society that prizes the image of virtue over real. Virtue is on the path to corruption, manipulation, and moral decay. Plato warns, the false just are more dangerous than the openly unjust, because the unjust can be confronted, but the deceivers, those who wear the mask of virtue, are harder to detect. They charm, they influence, they become public role models, they dress immorality in the language of ethics, and in doing so, they make evil seem normal. Here, Plato's critique goes even deeper. It's not just political, it's ontological. For him, the visible world, the world we see with our eyes, hear through public opinion, and sense through the body, is a world of shadows. It's unstable, deceptive, shaped by appearances. The real world, the world of ideas, is the world of essence. In that world, the good isn't an image, but a higher reality. This is the famous, intelligible world, which can only be reached through reason, deep reflection, and the purification of the soul. At the center of that world is the idea of the good, the highest of all ideas. Plato compares it to the sun. It's what makes everything visible, what gives meaning to knowledge, and what guides us toward a just life. But this good is not easy to grasp. It's often hidden beneath a pile of lesser goods, popular opinions, social rewards, quick pleasures, and shallow praise. That's why Plato believed real education isn't about memorizing moral rules. It's about guiding the soul out of the cave of appearances. This is the message of his famous allegory of the cave, where prisoners live chained, watching shadows on a wall, believing those shadows are real. Only the philosopher escapes, sees the sun, understands the truth, and returns to the cave, even if he's rejected by those still in love with the illusions. This metaphor shows us something powerful. The greatest enemy of morality isn't obvious vice, it's ignorance dressed up as virtue. It's pride wearing the mask of humility. It's power pretending to be justice. It's lies that learn how to look like truth. For Plato, moral deception isn't just a mistake, it's a perversion, because it corrupts more than just actions. It corrupts the soul. It blocks self-awareness. It cuts off our path to real goodness. It causes people to lose themselves, thinking they are just when they are really slaves to appearances. Plato invites us to take on a hard task. It's not enough to seem good. We must actually be good, and that takes philosophical courage. The courage to look inward, to examine the soul, to reject comfortable illusions, and to face the light of truth, even when it hurts. For Plato, morality is not a social performance, it's an inner transformation. And as long as society continues to reward those who only pretend to be virtuous, it will remain blind and maybe lost. Paul Ricoeur, a 20th century French philosopher, wasn't a thinker of scandal. He was a thinker of deep listening. He didn't aim to destroy moral traditions, but to understand them from within, even when that meant challenging them. His legacy is defined by the balance between radical critique and ethical reconstruction, and for that, he offers a starting point: distrust. Ricoeur coined a phrase that became central in contemporary philosophy: the masters of suspicion. He used this label for three key thinkers who broke away from the naivety of traditional morality: Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx. Each of them, in their own way, revealed that many of our most established moral beliefs, the ones that seem pure, universal, sacred, often hide darker motivations: a will to power, repressed desire, or class, interests. The ethics of distrust, then, is not a rejection of morality. It's a challenge to its surface. It's a demand for depth. A way of asking, what's really behind the language of goodness? From Nietzsche, we learn that so-called good morality may actually be resentment in disguise. People who feel powerless in life create a moral system that condemns strength, pleasure, and affirmation, turning their limitations into rules and using goodness as a way to control others. Nietzsche's genealogy of morality shows that moral values aren't natural, they're historical and strategic. From Freud, we learn that morality isn't just born from reason, it can also come from psychological repression. Often, we act morally not out of conviction, but because of unconscious fear, childhood guilt, or buried desire. His concept of reaction formation reveals how acts of kindness can actually be a cover for unacceptable urges. And the superego, the internal moral voice, can become a harsh inner tyrant, demanding perfection and punishing even healthy desires. From Marx, we learn that morality can function as an ideological tool. The dominant moral ideas, he argues, are not neutral. They serve the ruling class. Values like merit, discipline, or sacrifice can be used to justify exploitation, keep workers obedient, and preserve economic structures. In this sense, morality becomes part of the machinery of social domination. Ricoeur doesn't fully adopt any of these thinkers, but he sees them as necessary disruptors. They force us to stop treating morality as a closed system, as an absolute truth, or as a clear and innocent narrative. They teach us that morality needs critique, that blindly trusting in the language of goodness leaves us open to manipulation. This critical stance is what Ricoeur calls a hermeneutics of suspicion. It's hermeneutics because it's about interpretation, digging for meaning beneath what's being said. And it's suspicion because that meaning may be something else entirely, even the opposite of what it seems. A moral appeal to compassion might really be about control. A call for sacrifice might come from bitterness. A demand for purity might be rooted in repression. But here's where Ricoeur's brilliance shows. He doesn't stop at suspicion. He sees it as essential, but not enough. Because critique that only tears down, that only exposes, risks slipping into nihilism, the belief that nothing has value, that everything is just self-interest, repression, or power. So Ricoeur proposes something harder and more meaningful, an ethics of responsibility, built on distrust, but open to rebuilding. Our critique of false morality shouldn't turn us into cynics. It should make us more careful. It shouldn't lead us to reject morality entirely, but to reform it with greater honesty, awareness, and maturity. For Ricoeur, true ethics doesn't come from purity. It comes from recognizing conflict, from understanding that we are divided, messy, contradictory beings, that our desire to do good exists alongside fears, escapes, and power drives, that our institutions are shaped by self-interest, that our moral claims must be examined constantly. And that's exactly why we need a stronger ethic, one that can face the complexity of the real world, one that doesn't hide behind perfect ideals, one that refuses rigid dogmas, one that can recognize evil, especially when it's done in the name of good. This ethics of distrust is not paralyzing. On the contrary, it forces us to think more clearly, to act more responsibly, and to question easy answers. It's an ethic that demands listening, reflection, and continuous dialogue. an ethic that treats vulnerability not as weakness, but as the starting point. Ricoeur also reminds us that moral language needs symbols, stories, and interpretation. We don't live by rules alone, we live by narratives, by shared experiences, by examples. That's why he valued literature, memory, and otherness, not to replace critique, but to give rebuilt morality a more human dimension. So this ethics of distrust becomes an ethics of responsibility toward the other. Because in the end, all suspicion should lead us back to the essential questions. What am I doing to the other? What am I allowing? What am I ignoring? This move from critique to responsibility is what makes Ricoeur's philosophy so deep. He gives us the courage to doubt, but also the courage to rebuild. He teaches us that clarity shouldn't make us cold. It should help us grow. We live in a time when moral language is being used everywhere, often distorted, often shallow. Ricoeur's message remains urgent. Yes, be suspicious, but never stop seeking what is just. Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers in literary history, didn't settle for just portraying human dilemmas with artistic mastery. In his later years, he became a fierce critic of the morality of his time, especially what he called the false goodness of civilized society. His critique is deep, ethical, spiritual, and extremely relevant today. For Tolstoy, civilized society, especially its political, religious, and economic elites, built an image of itself rooted in apparent virtues, charity, politeness, patriotism, progress, and education. But behind that image, he saw something very different: hypocrisy, injustice, vanity, and indifference disguised as morality. His break from the aristocratic world he was born into was radical. He gave up his inheritance, chose to live simply, turned away from his earlier literary fame, and embraced a demanding, practical spirituality, inspired mainly by the ethical teachings of Jesus, but without the involvement of institutional religion, which he saw as complicit with power. Tolstoy saw a deep contradiction in how the elite claimed to be good, cultured, or virtuous, while upholding a system built on exploitation, inequality, and institutional violence. For him, that kind of goodness was nothing but an illusion. In The Kingdom of God is Within You, one of his most powerful philosophical works, he writes, "All the progress of civilization is nothing but a refinement of the forms of violence, disguised as order and legality." This line captures the core of his critique. Modern civilization didn't eliminate barbarism, it just made it more polished. War, for example, was now justified in the name of patriotism. The exploitation of the poor defended in the name of merit. Religion used to numb consciences and block moral outrage. Tolstoy saw all of this as a betrayal of true ethics. For him, real goodness cannot coexist with privilege, with oppression, or with comfort built on the suffering of others. He sharply criticized those who spoke of morality while living off the labor of servants, peasants, or profits from a system that condemned most people to poverty. His moral vision wasn't theoretical, it was radically practical. He believed that living ethically required personal transformation and a break from unjust systems. That's why he preached absolute pacifism, nonviolent resistance, vegetarianism, rejection of military service, and even refusal to pay taxes that funded war. This stance brought him close to figures like Gandhi, who openly declared that Tolstoy's writings deeply influenced his philosophy. Tolstoy didn't just speak as a novelist, he became an ethical prophet of his time, and his message deeply disturbed the social structures around him. In Resurrection, another morally charged novel, Tolstoy tells the story of an aristocrat who confronts the injustice of the Russian legal and prison systems. As the character wakes up to how society punishes the poor, while the wealthy maintain a facade of virtue, he begins to unravel. The story reflects Tolstoy's own awakening. The more time he spent with peasants, the more he saw the gap between declared goodness and lived reality. Tolstoy spared no one in his critique. He saw the education system as a tool for taming people. institutional religion as a weapon of control, the military as a machine of death, traditional marriage as a form of oppression, and elite philanthropy as a way to ease guilt without changing the system. His attack on false goodness is, at its core, an attack on comfortable morality, the kind that's happy doing what's possible within the system without ever questioning the system itself, the kind that confuses charity with justice, the kind that prefers the peace of a virtuous life, as long as privilege remains untouched. Tolstoy believed that true morality demands sacrifice. It demands coherence. It demands discomfort. It cannot exist alongside the accumulation of wealth, the defense of borders, or the use of violence. That's why he rejected the kind of goodness that is easy, praised, and socially accepted. His critique feels deeply modern. In a world where moral language is everywhere, in corporate marketing, celebrity branding, shallow activism, Tolstoy asks, who's willing to pay the price of actually living out the good they claim to believe in? False goodness is still alive. You see it in philanthropy that doesn't address the root of inequality, in politics that uses morality as a rhetorical weapon, in religion that comforts the privileged while silencing the poor. Tolstoy teaches us that it's not enough to appear just. We must live justice. And that means breaking social norms, facing rejection, letting go of comforts. His path was lonely. His ideas were censored. He was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church, but he never abandoned his belief that real ethics begins where convenience ends. Tolstoy doesn't offer us an easy answer. He offers us a mirror. And in that mirror, we don't just see others, we see ourselves. The question his work still asks today is simple and sharp. Is our goodness real or just civilized? In a world increasingly filled with pre-packaged opinions, external rules, and suffocating social expectations, Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor brings back an idea that may sound simple at first, but is actually radical. Without authenticity, goodness becomes fake. In other words, it's not enough to look good or to follow moral rules just because they're expected. Moral action has to be rooted in who you truly are. This is the core of what Taylor calls the ethics of authenticity, a central concept in his book, The Ethics of Authenticity, 1991, and explored more deeply in works like Sources of the Self. For Taylor, modernity brought a major shift in how we understand ourselves. We no longer live in a society that simply imposes, from the outside, what is good, just, or right. Today, we're expected to become the authors of our own lives, and with that comes a new moral demand, the call to be true to our deepest self. Taylor acknowledges that this ideal of authenticity emerged strongly in the modern era. It's a legacy of Romanticism, existentialism, and other traditions that emphasize subjectivity, but he doesn't see it as self-indulgent or selfish. He sees it as an ethical achievement because, in his view, authenticity isn't doing whatever you want. It's living in line with what you recognize as truly valuable. That's a key point. Some people criticize the idea of authenticity as a sign of modern narcissism, as if just following your heart or being true to yourself justifies any behavior. Taylor disagrees with this shallow take. For him, real authenticity requires dialogue, responsibility, and depth. An authentic person isn't someone who ignores others or rejects social norms. It's someone who thinks critically about them, who shapes their identity through engagement with the world and with tradition, and who chooses values with commitment, not casually. The ethics of authenticity, then, isn't selfishness. It's staying true to a deeper good discovered within, but never in isolation. That's why Taylor says our identity isn't a private project. It's formed in the space between the self and the other, in the conversations we have, the cultural influences we absorb, the inner struggles we face. And through that process, goodness stops being a social performance and starts becoming a genuine expression of the person. Without that foundation, morality becomes hollow. It might follow the rules, but it loses its soul. It becomes a performance. Think of someone who's kind just because it looks good or is socially expected. There's something false about that kind of goodness. It doesn't come from inner values. It comes from the need for approval. It's moral behavior as a costume. Taylor clearly warns about this risk. When morality gets disconnected from authenticity, it becomes empty. Ethical action, to be real, has to be connected to inner meaning, to a consciously chosen life ideal. This message becomes especially important in a culture like ours, filled with superficiality, personal branding, and social media. We're surrounded by public moral gestures, causes, campaigns, statements that often have more to do with image than conviction. Taylor doesn't condemn public expressions of ethics, but he asks, what's behind them? Are they rooted in real commitment or just an attempt to belong? The ethics of authenticity, in this light, is a call to depth. It demands that each of us sincerely search for what makes life worth living. And beyond that, to live according to that truth, even when it means going against trends, groupthink, or comfort. Taylor also points to a modern paradox. On one hand, we've never had so much freedom to be ourselves. On the other hand, we've never been so pressured to follow pre-made identity templates. And that's exactly why authenticity is both so necessary and so difficult. It takes inner work, constant self-reflection, critical thinking, and real choices. It also takes courage, the courage to live without external guarantees, to trust a sense of meaning that doesn't come from outside, but is built from within. But this courage, according to Taylor, isn't solitary. Authenticity takes shape through encounter, through mutual recognition, listening to different moral traditions, and real dialogue. There's no true self without community. So the ethics of authenticity doesn't cancel out common morality. It revives it from within. It lets us live out values like justice, compassion, truth, and freedom in a more rooted, personal, and responsible way. At the end of the day, Charles Taylor offers a bridge between the individual and the world. He doesn't ask us to reject traditional morality, but to question it, rediscover it, and consciously choose what really matters. Because for him, real goodness isn't about repetition. It's about meaningful creation. And meaning only emerges when life is lived authentically, with clarity, with truth, and with fidelity to the self. In the West, we usually see kindness as an unquestionable virtue. Helping others, showing compassion, making sacrifices, all of this is immediately seen as noble, selfless, and virtuous. But in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, this view is deeply challenged. What if even kindness can become a form of attachment? That question, which sounds paradoxical at first, reveals one of the most sophisticated and counterintuitive teachings in Buddhist philosophy. According to Mahayana, altruism, if not purified by wisdom, can turn into just another expression of ego. A refined, subtle, almost invisible ego, but still ego. To understand this, we need to get to the heart of the Buddhist view of the mind and reality. In Mahayana, the entire spiritual path is aimed at freedom from suffering, not just obvious suffering like pain and loss, but the deeper suffering rooted in ignorance, which means misunderstanding the nature of reality. This ignorance shows up especially in the belief in a separate, solid, permanent self, a self that wants to control, protect, or prove itself. This illusory I is the root of all attachment, including attachment to being good, useful, or generous. Mahayana teaches that the ego can hide even in our highest forms of compassion. A practitioner who helps others while seeking recognition, spiritual merit, admiration, or even good karma in the future is, often without realizing it, turning kindness into a more polished form of craving. This is what teachers call subtle attachment to virtue. It happens when someone clings to the idea of being a compassionate person, and holds tightly to that identity. This kind of attachment isn't aggressive, it's soft, almost invisible, but it still creates suffering because it reinforces duality. I am the one who helps. You are the one who needs help. In that gesture, there's still separation, still ego, still desire. That's why Mahayana offers a higher ideal than everyday altruism, the awakening of bodhicitta, the mind, of enlightenment. Bodhicitta is the deep wish to achieve enlightenment not just for oneself, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. But even this intention needs to be purified of ego fixation. The great teacher Shantideva, in the classic Bodhicharyavatara, writes, "All the joy in the world comes from wishing others to be happy. All the suffering in the world comes from wishing myself to be happy." This radical reversal invites us to question the real motivation behind our actions. Even when we help, even when we're being kind, what's driving that? Is it true love, free from self-centeredness, or is it subtle attachment to a moral identity? Here, Mahayana connects to the teaching of emptiness, shunyata, the understanding that all things, including the self, and even our acts of kindness, are empty of inherent existence. According to Mahayana, real compassion doesn't come from the idea of me helping you. It comes from realizing that there is no true separation between self and other. From that insight arises a natural compassion, effortless, humble, and free from attachment. That's why great teachers warn, kindness based on the illusion of self can become a trap. It can create expectations, disappointment, spiritual pride, and even resentment. I did so much for this person, and they didn't even thank me. That kind of thinking shows that the kindness was mixed with the desire for return. So it's still suffering, still samsara. But Mahayana Buddhism doesn't reject kindness. On the contrary, it places kindness at the center of the path. But it demands that kindness be practiced with clarity. True kindness isn't based on a virtuous self. It's rooted in the union of wisdom and compassion. Wisdom that sees emptiness, compassion that recognizes the other's suffering as not separate from your own. This union defines the ideal of the bodhisattva, a being who, even though they could attain nirvana, chooses to remain in the world to help free all beings. But the bodhisattva doesn't see themselves as a hero or a martyr. They act without attachment to the outcome, without moral vanity, without clinging to an identity. They act from insight, not from self-preservation, dressed up as virtue. In everyday life, this leads to a difficult but essential question. Am I helping out of compassion or out of a need to prove something? Mahayana asks us to reflect on this, not to judge ourselves, but to wake up, to clearly see where there's still me, still attachment, still duality. This view offers an ethics very different from the Western one. In the West, goodness is usually measured by visible actions. In Mahayana, it's measured by the intention free of attachment and by the wisdom behind it. So kindness isn't an identity to build. It's a natural flow that comes from an awakened mind. And that's the most difficult and most freeing lesson. For kindness to be real, it must be anonymous, free, without me. Mahayana reminds us that even altruism can trap us if we're not mindful of what drives it. But when kindness comes from a mind empty of ego and full of compassion, it stops being just a moral act and becomes a reflection of wisdom. Jean-Paul Sartre, a central figure of French existentialism, worked tirelessly to expose the subtle ways human beings try to escape their own freedom. For Sartre, freedom isn't optional, it's our condition. We are condemned to be free, as he famously wrote in his masterpiece, Being and Nothingness. But with freedom comes a heavy burden, full responsibility for who we are. There are no metaphysical excuses, no external justifications. We are what we choose to be, even when we pretend we're not choosing at all. It's in this context that Sartre examines the figure of the so-called man of goodwill. Kaunim, the surface. This person seems moral, concerned with justice, with others, with doing the right thing. But through the existentialist lens, this image may hide something much deeper and more unsettling. Bad faith. Bad faith, mauvaise foi, is one of Sartre's most central and most disturbing concepts. It's a radical form of self-deception, but it's not a mistake in logic or reasoning. It's a lie we tell ourselves. And the paradox is, deep down, we know it's a lie. Bad faith isn't ignorance. It's the conscious refusal to face the truth of our freedom, and the man of goodwill can be a master of this kind of lie. He acts as though he's committed to moral ideals, guided by a higher purpose, with nothing but good intentions. But according to Sartre, this behavior often serves to avoid making real personal choices. By hiding behind external rules, inherited values, social expectations, or noble causes, the man of goodwill projects a moral framework onto the world, a framework that conveniently relieves him of personal responsibility. He claims to follow principles, but they're not principles he chose freely. He clings to them so he doesn't have to face the anxiety of deciding for himself. Sartre writes, "Bad faith is fleeing from what you cannot flee, trying to be what you are by nature, and denying what you are by freedom." In other words, the person in bad faith wants to be a thing, something fixed, defined, safe. He wants to have a stable essence, like being a good person. But in existentialism, there's no essence before existence. Human beings are not static. We are a constant work in progress, and every attempt to freeze ourselves into a final identity, good, just, honest, is really a way of dodging the responsibility of becoming. In that sense, the man of goodwill becomes a dangerous figure. He treats goodness as a label, a status, a secure place to rest. But for Sartre, no one is good by nature. There are only good actions, taken in real contexts, under real conditions, and those who hide behind the image of being a decent person may in truth be hiding from the world. Sartre isn't saying that all goodwill is fake. What he's criticizing is the way goodwill can be used to avoid dealing with conflict, complexity, and the responsibility to choose and to fail. The man of goodwill often sees himself as morally superior. He takes pride in his intentions, in his effort, in his ethics. But at the same time, he refuses to take responsibility for the actual effects of his choices. He believes that meaning well is enough. But in Sartre's view, intention without action is cowardice. Goodness without responsibility is an illusion. Morality without freedom is bad faith. That's why Sartre is so blunt. There is no such thing as being good in some fixed way. There is only doing good in specific situations, at specific moments, under the weight of freedom. And freedom is terrifying. It offers no guarantees, no instruction manual, no automatic forgiveness. The bad faith of the man of goodwill also shows up when he uses his morality to judge others, but excuses himself. He believes he's on the right side, the just side, the ethical side, and that gives him permission to act with rigidity, self-righteousness, or even cruelty, all in the name of doing good. But for Sartre, no cause, no matter how noble, frees us from responsibility for our methods. No ideology saves us from freedom. No ideal redeems us if we become oppressors in its name. Existentialist ethics is an ethics with no excuses. There's no hiding behind good intentions, no escaping freedom, no passing off your responsibility to someone else. The man of bad faith is the one who uses morality as armor against the risks of freedom. But by doing that, he betrays his own human condition, which is to be freedom in action. Sartre calls us to go beyond good intentions. He urges us to face with clarity and courage the ethical task of existing, to choose, to act, to make mistakes, to begin again, without pretending to be something we're not, without hiding behind a mask of goodness. Freedom is a burden. but it's the only burden that makes us truly human. Few thinkers of the 20th century stirred up as much moral discomfort as Ayn Rand. Born in Russia and later becoming an American citizen, Rand broke away from nearly every ethical tradition that celebrates altruism, self-sacrifice, and personal denial. In their place, she raised a radical and deeply controversial banner: rational selfishness as the ultimate virtue. In her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, 1964, Rand delivered her most direct critique. Altruism is the doctrine that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification of his life. For Rand, altruism isn't just an ethical ideal, it's a destructive ideology. It demands that individuals deny their own interests, desires, and values in the name of some greater good, whether that's society, the state, religion, or simply other people. And this renunciation, she argues, isn't noble, it's suicidal. Her critique strikes at the heart of many philosophical and religious traditions that glorify sacrifice. To Rand, self-sacrifice isn't a sign of virtue, it's a sign of self-denial. And no true value can come from denying the self. In the logic of objectivism, human life has value precisely because it is the life of a conscious, rational individual, acting in pursuit of their own fulfillment. The idea that goodness lies in serving others, even at your own expense, is, to her, an attack on human dignity. Rand rejects the image of the altruistic hero who erases themselves to save the world. To her, the true hero is the one who refuses to be sacrificed, who creates, builds, and lives for their own sake, and in doing so, contributes authentically to the world. This vision is powerfully expressed in her philosophical novels, especially The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Her protagonists, like Howard Rourke and John Galt, don't ask permission to exist. They are uncompromising creators, guided by a code of merit, reason, and independence. They don't live for others, but they also don't expect others to live for them. Rand describes this as a relationship based on voluntary exchange of values, not sacrifice. At this point, her critique of altruism takes on more nuance. Rand isn't attacking spontaneous kindness, affection, or genuine generosity between free individuals. What she condemns is the idea that the moral value of an action depends on how much it costs the person doing it. To her, an action is only moral if it reflects freely chosen personal values, not if it's done out of guilt, fear, social pressure, or a need for approval. When altruism becomes institutionalized, Rand argues, it turns into a system of moral blackmail. It becomes a tool for those who want to control others: politicians, religious leaders, ideologues, manipulators. By using the ideal of sacrifice, these figures cultivate guilt in productive, creative, independent people and convince them that they must serve in the name of something greater. This view is especially critical of collectivism, ideologies that place the group above the individual. Whether it appears as socialism, nationalism, or religious communalism, Rand sees collectivism as the final form of coercive altruism. The individual is just a cog in the machine. Their worth depends on their usefulness. Their life can be sacrificed for an idea. That's why she wrote, "Collectivism is the logical end of altruism. The individual must die so that the group may live." Her ethical proposal is the complete opposite. Instead of altruism, Rand proposes rational selfishness, an ethics grounded in reason, integrity, and the conscious choice of values that support individual life and happiness. She's not talking about destructive, impulsive, or narcissistic selfishness. She's talking about ethical egoism, the refusal to use or be used, the recognition of others as free individuals, and the choice to live not for them, but also not against them. This position is undoubtedly radical, and for many, it's unacceptable. But that's exactly what gives it power as a philosophical contrast, because it forces traditional morality to defend itself, to explain why sacrifice is good, why altruism is virtuous, and why living for others is supposed to be better than living for yourself. Rand forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do we value suffering for the sake of others so much? Isn't altruism sometimes just a disguised form of control? Is there really virtue in self-denial? Or is that just fear hiding behind morality? In an age flooded with moral posturing, where goodness often looks like submission, and individual value is blurred in the name of collective causes, Rand's critique still echoes, not because it gives final answers, but because it makes us think from the ground up, starting with the individual. Her ethics aren't easy, and they're far from comforting, but they are coherent, and maybe her most important lesson isn't about rejecting others, but about remembering that we can only truly respect others when we have the courage to affirm ourselves. What is good? It sounds like a simple question, one that has guided moral philosophy for centuries. Many thinkers have tried to define it in universal terms. Good as what fulfills human nature, what aligns with duty, what promotes happiness, or what reduces suffering. But Michel Foucault, a French philosopher of the 20th century, took a radically different turn. What if good isn't an eternal truth, but a historical construction? What if morality is actually a product of power? That's one of the central ideas in Foucault's work. He wasn't interested in the good in a metaphysical sense. He wanted to understand how certain behaviors came to be seen as good, right, or normal, and who benefited from that. For Foucault, morality isn't a truth we uncover, it's a language we construct. And like any language, it has authors, rules, institutions, and real-world consequences. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault analyzes how punishment changed in Western societies. He shows how the shift from physical punishment to disciplinary institutions, like prisons, schools, and hospitals, wasn't a sign of progress or humanization. It was a transformation in how control is exercised. Power stopped being visibly violent and became invisible every day and rooted in norms. And in that process, the language of good played a crucial role. It made new systems of surveillance and discipline acceptable because they were seen as rational, civilized, and correct. Foucault's point is that good is often the name power gives to its own logic. By framing certain norms as good, power not only justifies its control, it turns its own interests into moral truths. And that's how morality becomes a tool for governing bodies, behaviors, and even people's thoughts. This critique goes even deeper in the history of sexuality. There, Foucault explores how moral discourse around sex, especially starting in the 17th century, became a way to manage populations. Contrary to the belief that Western society has always repressed sexuality, he argues that what really happened was an explosion of discourse about it. Doctors, psychologists, judges, and educators all began defining what was healthy, normal, desirable. And once again, the idea of good was used to justify it. The good of public health, the good of the family, the good of public morality. But to Foucault, these categories aren't neutral. They're tools of power. When someone labels a Yuri sexual identity as deviant, or a body as immoral, or a behavior as proper, they're drawing lines of inclusion and exclusion. They're defining who deserves protection, who deserves punishment, who needs correction, all in the name of the good. Here, good is no longer a pure value. It becomes socially constructed, historically shaped, and politically useful. There is no single, universal good, only systems of knowledge and institutions that decide, in each era, what counts as good. That's why Foucault argued that all knowledge is entangled with power. There's no such thing as neutral, moral knowledge. All morality, to some extent, is a form of governing souls. It teaches us how to live, what to want, how to behave, and, more subtly, how to judge ourselves. This is what Foucault called biopower, power that doesn't just repress but shapes life itself, our identities, our beliefs, our bodies. Power that operates not through violence but through language, habits, expectations, and morality. Do this because it's right. Be this way because it's best. Feel guilty because you failed. Foucault's critique isn't a rejection of ethics, but a deconstruction of morality as something natural or eternal. He's not saying everything is relative or we should abandon values. He's saying we should ask, who defined these values and why? Who gets to decide what's good in society? Who benefits from that definition? And who gets excluded? This line of questioning is fundamental in contemporary social analysis. It helps us see how ideas like well-being, order, or progress were used to justify colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and homophobia, not as distortions of goodness, but as part of how good was historically constructed in the first place. Foucault teaches us to think of ethics as historical, political, and critical, and maybe most importantly, he shows us that freedom doesn't come from obeying morality. It comes from questioning its foundations. That's why he valued the idea of resistance so deeply. For Foucault, resisting isn't about fighting power head-on with force. It's about shifting the narrative, creating new ways of living, inventing new ways of being. At its core, his philosophy invites us to a radical kind of clarity. To understand that good is not absolute, but that we are still responsible for imagining a more just world. Morality, when left unquestioned, becomes dogma. But when challenged, it becomes a path forward. Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest modern philosophers, developed one of the most demanding and rigorous views of morality. For him, ethics shouldn't be based on desires, personal interests, or emotions. It must be grounded in reason, and reason alone. At the core of his moral philosophy is a crucial distinction: acting out of duty versus acting out of inclination. While that difference might sound subtle at first, it's actually the heart of Kant's ethics. Because, for Kant, the moral value of an action doesn't lie in its outcome or how it makes you feel, but in the intention behind it. In Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant writes, "Nothing can be considered good without limitation, except a good will. That means the only thing that is truly morally good, no matter the consequences, is the will to do the right thing simply because it is right. That motivation shouldn't come from fear, reward, or sympathy. It should come from a sense of duty." So what is duty? For Kant, duty is the need to act according to a rational principle that could apply to everyone. This is what he calls the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, always ask yourself, what if everyone acted like me? If the answer leads to contradiction or chaos, then the action isn't moral. This test takes personal gain, feelings, or special situations out of the equation. That's where the difference between duty and inclination comes in. Imagine someone helps others because they feel compassion or because it makes them feel good. Kant would say that's a good act, but not fully moral. Why? Because the action is based on an emotional response, not a rational decision. If one day the compassion fades or the good feeling disappears, so does the motivation. Now imagine someone else who doesn't naturally feel empathy but still chooses to help, simply because they recognize through reason that it's their moral duty to treat others as ends in themselves, not as tools or means. That person, Kant says, has more moral worth, even if they feel less, because their action comes from a rational choice, not from fleeting emotions. This distinction for Kant is all about moral freedom. When we act out of duty, we exercise practical reason. We rise above instinct and become truly autonomous. Inclinations, no matter how noble, tie us to what is emotional, temporary, and unstable. Duty, on the other hand, connects us to what is universal, unconditional, and rooted in the dignity of reason. But Kant isn't saying feelings are bad. He's saying that morality shouldn't depend on them. Emotions are unpredictable, uneven, and shaped by culture or upbringing. You can't build a solid ethical system on something so unstable. Reason, however, is shared by all and can be the foundation of universal ethics. This has deep implications. Morality becomes a matter of personal responsibility, not emotional. Spontaneity. To be moral, in Kant's view, is to do the right thing, even when you don't want to, even when it's hard, even when it goes against your own interests. And that's exactly what gives duty its value. It pushes us to do what's right, especially when it would be easier not to. That's where Kant introduces his idea of the kingdom of ends, an ideal community where all rational beings treat each other as ends in themselves, never as means. This is where respect comes in, not as a feeling, but as a rational principle. Respecting someone isn't about liking them or feeling empathy. It's about recognizing that they're a free moral agent, just like you. And that makes them inherently valuable. Kant's ethics are demanding, maybe even too strict for some. After all, it asks us to let go of emotion, desire, and affection, and act purely out of reason. But that's where its strength lies. Kant offers an ethics of autonomy, a morality that doesn't depend on luck, culture, or feelings, but on each person's rational freedom. In a world where many ethical decisions are driven by empathy, public opinion, or outcomes, Kant reminds us of something important. To act morally is not to do what feels right. It's to do what is right. And that sense of duty doesn't come from outside. It's not imposed by God, society, or the law. It comes from within, from our own rational mind. That's why Kant says duty is sublime. Because it shows that even though we're bound by the physical world, we are still capable of moral freedom. So in the end, good isn't what feels nice. It's not what works best. It's not even what makes us feel virtuous. For Kant, good is whatever can be made a universal rule without contradiction, and that treats every human being as an absolute end. To be ethical, then, is to be free. And to be free, in Kant's view, is to obey the moral law you give to yourself through reason. In a world full of moral posturing, carefully crafted reputations, and virtue displayed like a product on social media, the teachings of Confucius come back as a call for something deeper. Though he lived in 5th century BC China, his ethical ideas offer a powerful response to one of the oldest and most current problems in public and personal life: fake virtue. For Confucius, real virtue isn't a performance. It's not about impressing others, gaining status, or earning approval. True virtue is quiet, consistent, humble, and deeply rooted within. In the Confucian tradition, this inner moral strength is called dai, often translated as virtue, but carrying a broader meaning that includes integrity, moral presence, and inner strength. In the Analects, a collection of his teachings, Confucius says, "The superior man is modest in speech but rich in action. Virtue does not dwell in appearances, but in consistency of character." These phrases highlight a key theme in Confucian ethics: appearance versus substance. To Confucius, the truly ethical person, the junzi, or noble man, is someone who cultivates themselves from the inside out. They act with integrity, even when no one is watching. The opposite of this ideal is the xiaoren, or small person, driven by self-interest, vanity, and superficiality. This kind of person can appear upright while hiding selfish motives. They pretend to care but only want praise. They talk about justice but act out of convenience. This kind of moral hypocrisy, this fake virtue, was for Confucius one of the biggest threats to social harmony and public trust. Because when morality becomes a performance, it loses its power to truly transform and becomes a tool for manipulation. Confucius's criticism of fake virtue is really a defense of ethics as a living practice, not a show. He insisted that moral education begins inside the individual with what he called cheng, or sincerity, the alignment of thought, speech, and action. Sincerity here doesn't just mean not lying. It means living with deep internal truth, so that virtue isn't something you show off, it's simply who you are. This leads to a powerful question. What does it really mean to be good? Is it just about following rules, saying the right things, repeating trendy phrases? Or is it something deeper, like showing respect even in adversity, keeping your word with no witnesses, helping others without needing recognition? For Confucius, the answer lies in the ongoing practice of self-cultivation. He didn't believe in instant morality. He understood that character is built over time through discipline, habits, and reflection. And unlike public displays of virtue, real integrity takes patience and silence. In one of his classic quotes, he says, "Those who know what is right are not equal to those who love what is right, and those who love what is right are not equal to those who delight in practicing it." That's the difference between knowing what's right and actually doing it without needing praise. Fake virtue stops at the first step. Looking informed, sounding thoughtful, seeming just. But for Confucius, that's only the beginning. Real morality requires quiet, consistent, and unpretentious action. This message is especially relevant today, where image often replaces substance. We're surrounded by moral messages, in ads, on social media, in politics, in corporate branding. But how often do those words translate into real actions? How often is kindness just marketing? Confucius warns us, when a society values the appearance of virtue more than its quiet practice, it begins to fall apart. Relationships become performances. Trust erodes. Ethics becomes just another transaction. And worse, those who truly live with integrity are ignored, while those who know how to sell goodness are rewarded. His solution is demanding. Each person must look inward and ask themselves honestly whether their actions come from a sincere desire for justice, respect, loyalty, and compassion, or if they're just strategies to maintain an image. This doesn't mean we should reject public recognition, but it's a reminder that the ethical value of an action isn't found in applause, it's in the integrity behind it. Confucius also saw ethics as something relational. Virtue isn't just a personal quality, it shows up in how we treat others, honoring parents, respecting elders, being honest with friends, being fair in all dealings. So virtue isn't just a feeling, it's a way of being in the world, and the more real it is, the quieter it tends to be. Confucius's wisdom is still powerful today because it reminds us of something our culture often forgets. Ethics is not a performance, it's character. And character isn't built with speeches, it's built with silent, steady, daily actions. Fake virtue may fool others for a while, but real virtue transforms the person who lives it for good. Max Stirner, a 19th century German philosopher, occupies an uncomfortable and therefore deeply important place in the world of ethics. In a society where morality is often praised as the universal guide to right and wrong, Stirner shows up as a disruptive voice, challenging the very foundation of moral thinking. His main idea, developed in his book The Ego and Its Own, is both simple and explosive. The morality we're taught to believe is good is often just a form of slavery. To him, traditional goodness, the kind promoted by religion, social norms, and conventional ethics, is servile morality. A morality based on submission. But submission to what? To an ideal. Stirner argues that human beings have long lived under the rule of absolute ideas: God, the state, humanity, duty, truth, and have bowed to these concepts like loyal servants. He calls these abstract ideals spooks, Spook in German. Ghostly ideas treated as sacred, gaining power over people's lives. And traditional morality, in his view, is just religion in disguise. Goodness, then, is just a fancy name for obedience. People do good because they're told they must, because it's a commandment, because it's right. But Stirner asks, right for whom? Right why? And that, he says, reveals the trap. We do good because we've been trained to serve, to sacrifice our desires, our will, our uniqueness, in the name of something supposedly greater than us. This isn't just political or religious submission, it's existential. Servile morality turns a person into a tool for values they never chose, only inherited. As a result, the individual becomes hollowed out, obedient, predictable, virtuous, but at the cost of their own freedom. Stirner isn't saying ethical behavior is impossible. He's rejecting the idea that ethical behavior should be mandatory because of external pressures. For him, there's only one true source of value: the individual, the unique one, der Einzige. Each person is a one-of-a-kind being, absolute in themselves. And only when someone acts from within, guided by their own interests and desires, does their action have true meaning. This view is often labeled as philosophical egoism, but it's not just about selfishness or pleasure-seeking. Stirner is pushing something deeper and more radical, an ethics without duty, guilt, or sacred authority, an ethics of the sovereign self. That's why he writes, "Before me, the gods and men fall, for I am my own creator and my own judge." This is the ultimate rejection of servile morality. The individual stops being a slave to commandments and becomes the author of their own values. So what's good isn't what others say is good. It's what's good for me, in my uniqueness, in my moment, in my experience. But this kind of freedom is not comfortable. It demands that we let go of the security that traditional morality offers, that we stop using doing the right thing as a shield against the fear of making real choices, that we take full responsibility for what we do. No excuses, no forgiveness, no safety nets. Goodness, when forced as a duty, destroys a person's creative freedom. It standardizes, boxes in, and tames. Stirner sees this as a kind of spiritualized servitude. It's the morality of the herd, as Nietzsche would later say, where people find comfort in shared mediocrity and call it virtue. In this way, Stirner's critique is libertarian. He's not trying to destroy community or promote chaos. He's trying to put ethics back where it belongs, in the hands of the individual, rooted in radical autonomy. He's saying, if you want to be good, fine, but let it be your choice. If you want to help others, do it. But not because you were taught to sacrifice yourself. Do it because it expresses your true will. Stirner calls for the end of moral duty and replaces it with the idea of ownership. If I see something as good, I claim it as mine. If something oppresses me, even if it wears the mask of morality, I reject it. This way of thinking has real consequences for how we approach kindness in social and political life. How often do we act for the good of others, not because we believe in it, but because we don't want to look selfish? How often is altruism just a way to control people? How often is virtue just a strategy for gaining approval, belonging, or self-forgiveness? Stirner sees all of this as forms of bondage, and instead he offers an ethics where the self doesn't sacrifice, it asserts. An ethics where the self doesn't dissolve into commandments, it becomes a creator of value. If his philosophy feels dangerous, it's because it takes away the comfort of inherited rules. But if it feels freeing, it's because it gives the individual the right to be the author of their own life. Stirner doesn't want to teach us how to be good. He wants to teach us how to be free. And maybe, just maybe, freedom is the only thing worth calling truly moral. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of the most critical and thought-provoking voices of the Enlightenment. Instead of blindly praising reason and progress as the keys to human improvement, he asked a disturbing question. What if civilization hasn't made us better? What if it has actually corrupted us? That question leads to a powerful critique of social morality, meaning the values, customs, and so-called virtues promoted by modern society. For Rousseau, this morality is not sincere. It's a mask. Behind the talk of virtue, civility, and the common good hides selfishness, pride, envy, and the desire to dominate. In his work, Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, Rousseau outlines the story of society, starting in a hypothetical state of nature. In that natural state, humans are simple, independent, and relatively peaceful. They don't have big ambitions, private property, or a need to compare themselves to others. They live guided by a natural sense of compassion, what Rousseau calls a disgust at seeing another suffer. But everything changes with the rise of society. Property, institutions, customs, and conventions create a new kind of human being, the civilized man, who no longer acts from natural needs, but from comparison, rivalry, and a thirst for recognition. And that's where the hypocrisy begins. Rousseau writes, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. But these chains aren't made of iron. They're made of moral conventions that disguise oppression under the name of civility. Society teaches us to be polite, respectable, and virtuous. But often those virtues are just tools for status and self-promotion. Social morality preaches altruism but rewards selfishness in disguise. It talks about equality but reinforces inequality. It praises modesty but celebrates vanity. It demands that people be good, but only within a system that benefits the powerful. That's why Rousseau says social morality is a convenient fiction. It creates an idealized image of the human being, rational, virtuous, cooperative, while shaping a society built on competition, ambition, and hierarchy. This critique becomes even sharper when Rousseau talks about amour-propre, a corrupted kind of self-love based on comparing yourself to others. In the natural state, people feel amour de soi, a basic desire for self-preservation and well-being. But in society, this turns into a need to be seen, admired, respected, and praised. That hunger for approval feeds moral hypocrisy. People stop acting based on what feels truly right for them. They act based on what will get them praise. Morality becomes a performance. Being good means looking good, saying the right things, showing the right emotions, defending the popular values. But beneath the surface, the same selfish competitiveness that society encourages keeps operating. Rousseau's critique is harsh, but still very relevant today. How often do we see moral messages used to boost reputations, gain power, or show superiority? How often do public virtues hide private interests? How often is moralism used not to help, but to shame, silence, or exclude people who don't fit in? For Rousseau, this isn't a mistake. It's part of the system. Modern society depends on morality to function, but a shallow kind of morality that keeps up appearances and hides real conflict. The glossy surface of virtue doesn't solve injustice. It covers it up, or worse, it justifies it. In The Social Contract, Rousseau offers a different path, rebuilding society on a real social agreement, where liberty and equality aren't just pretty words, but lived realities. This requires a new kind of morality, one based not on appearances, but on authenticity. It's not about rejecting values, but grounding them in the general will, in a real, shared commitment to the common good. That means, among other things, bringing back ethical sincerity, rejecting the game of moral vanity, letting go of the need to please, being virtuous not to look virtuous, but because you genuinely care about justice and freedom. Rousseau, contrary to popular belief, didn't want us to return to the state of nature. He knew history can't be undone. What he wanted was to spark critical thinking, to show that technical and cultural progress doesn't automatically mean moral progress, and that if we truly want a just society, we first need to expose the hypocrisy behind today's definitions of goodness and morality. His message still matters, because we live in a time when the appearance of good often matters more than doing good, where image matters more than action, where the polished look of civility hides sophisticated ways of excluding people. Rousseau invites us to strip away that polish and ask, what's really behind our morality? Does it reflect freedom, or submission, justice, or vanity? That question, first asked in the 18th century, is still one of the most urgent of our time. Søren Kierkegaard, a 19th century Danish philosopher and theologian, was a fierce critic of the religious structures of his time. Unlike atheist thinkers who attacked religion from the outside, Kierkegaard criticized it from within Christianity itself, not as an enemy of faith, but as someone deeply troubled by what it had become. His central idea is unsettling. Institutionalized Christianity doesn't just betray the spirit of Christ, it replaces it with a comfortable, hollow, and hypocritical morality. For Kierkegaard, the church had become a place of social conformity, a theatre of virtue where people hide behind Christian morality without ever experiencing the anxiety, risk, and personal decision that true faith demands. This criticism is especially clear in his work, Fear and Trembling, 1843, where Kierkegaard retells the biblical story of Abraham. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, a command that goes completely against all conventional moral standards. But Abraham obeys, not because he's immoral, but because he acts in faith, taking a leap that defies all ethical logic. This is the key point Kierkegaard wants to make. Real faith cannot be reduced to morality. In fact, it often clashes with it, requiring what he calls a suspension of the ethical, letting go of universal moral standards in order to respond to a deep, personal, and absolute calling. To society, Abraham would look like a murderer, but to God, and through the lens of faith, he is the knight of faith. Kierkegaard calls this the paradox of faith, and his critique of institutional Christian morality comes from its inability to deal with this paradox. Instead of treating faith as an existential challenge, religious morality turns it into a set of social rules, formal duties, and polite behavior. The Christian life becomes something you complete, like a checklist of obligations, rather than a living encounter with the absolute. That's why he writes, "Becoming a Christian is the greatest of all human tasks, but the world has made it the easiest. The greatest danger to Christianity is becoming a Christian by habit." This habitual Christianity is exactly what Kierkegaard calls the mask of Christian morality. It's used to keep up appearances, to help people look good, just, and devout, without ever truly committing to faith, which for him is always tied to anxiety, loneliness, and radical choice. So his critique goes deeper than just calling out hypocrisy. He's saying that institutional religious morality can actually be a way to avoid real faith. It offers comfort where there should be despair, order where there should be a leap, rules where there should be freedom, and most of all, collective identity where there should be individual responsibility. Kierkegaard's Christianity is not collective. It's radically personal. Every human being stands alone before God in their full uniqueness. You can't hand that responsibility over to an institution, a preacher, or a dogma. This idea reflects his existentialist view. Each person is an unfinished project, full of anxiety, always facing their freedom and the risk of making mistakes. That's why true faith is rare. It's not about believing in doctrines, it's about betting your entire life on a direct, risky relationship with the divine. The person who lives in faith isn't the one who behaves well, goes to church, or repeats formulas, but the one who accepts uncertainty, doubt, and the leap into the unknown. In this sense, Kierkegaard's critique of Christian morality is really a warning against the domestication of transcendence. The organized church, in his view, has turned the figure of Christ, once a symbol of suffering and contradiction, into something polite, comfortable, and middle class. And in doing so, it's lost its power to challenge us. For Kierkegaard, real Christianity should be a scandal. It should shake us, disturb us, confront us with a call to live with passion, fear, and trembling. When it turns into social morality, into a code of conduct, it becomes an obstacle to faith itself. What makes this critique even more powerful is that Kierkegaard isn't rejecting faith. He's calling us back to its existential core. He wants to free Christianity from its bureaucratic morality. He wants to recover the living dimension of faith, the one that can't be explained or proven, only lived. In a world that puts so much value on image, conformity, and reputation, Kierkegaard invites us to ask, are our virtues just a way of avoiding real choice? Is our faith just a comfortable hiding place? The mask of Christian morality, for him, is a subtle lie, and that's what makes it so dangerous. It protects people from the anguish of real faith, but in doing so, separates them from God. True faith isn't measured by good behavior, it's measured by an authentic relationship with the infinite, and that kind of relationship is always lonely, risky, and transformative. In a world where everything needs to be shown, posted, and applauded, Stoicism offers a radically different way of living, virtue that doesn't need an audience. The Stoics, ancient philosophers like Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, didn't just talk about ethics. They lived it with a kind of quiet strength that resists vanity and moral showmanship. To the Stoics, virtue isn't a badge or a public identity. It's an inner practice, steady, silent, and often invisible to the world. In fact, showing off your virtue was something to be deeply suspicious of, because it often hides the very opposite of ethics, the need for attention and approval. Epictetus once said, "Don't take pride in being self-controlled, just be self-controlled. What's done quietly is worth more than what screams for attention." That quote sums up the Stoic attitude. Real virtue doesn't try to be admired, it just tries to be lived. Anyone who constantly talks about their good deeds, their compassion, or their fairness might care more about looking good than actually being good. And that's dangerous, because it turns ethics into a performance. Stoicism teaches that we should only worry about what's under our control, our actions, our judgments, our character. Other people's opinions, fame, and approval, those are out of our hands and irrelevant. They called them indifference. Trying to be virtuous just to be seen or praised is actually a distraction from what truly matters. It turns virtue into a means to an end, when it should be the end in itself. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, puts it even more clearly. Virtue doesn't shine through words, but through quiet actions. The more someone wants to look virtuous, the less they actually are. The issue, he says, isn't just showing off, it's the hidden motive behind it. Vanity is a subtle kind of ethical corruption. Someone who lives just to look just isn't interested in justice itself, only in the status it brings. That kind of morality is shallow, fragile, and dependent on outside circumstances. So it's not really morality at all. True Stoic virtue is built from inner consistency, what Seneca calls the rightness of the soul. It requires self-control, wisdom, and perseverance, qualities that don't develop for the sake of impressing others, but grow in the quiet moments of everyday choices. Marcus Aurelius, a Roman emperor and one of Stoicism's great thinkers, wrote in his journal Meditations, "Let others talk about doing good. Your only task is to do it, simply and without showing off." Even as the most powerful man in the world, Marcus Aurelius cultivated a deep sense of humility. He knew that power can corrupt unless it's balanced by self-awareness, and that constantly trying to show off your virtue is often a sign of inner insecurity. For the Stoics, virtue isn't something you have, it's something you do. It's a path, not a destination. A constant effort, not a final achievement. So anyone bragging about how virtuous they are has already missed the point. Real virtue requires constant self-vigilance. This message clashes hard with modern values, where ethics often gets turned into self-promotion. Social media, public speeches, moral activism, these can all become stages. But the Stoics warn us, when virtue becomes a performance, it starts losing its authenticity. That's why Stoic wisdom is so demanding. It asks you to do the right thing, even when no one's watching. to be fair even when it's difficult, to act with integrity even when it costs you something. It's not about rejecting recognition or avoiding the public eye, but not depending on them for your moral compass. Real virtue stands on its own. It's silent, not because it's shy, but because it's strong. That also means, for the Stoics, avoiding quick judgment of others. Epictetus advises, don't say someone was wrong, just say they acted according to what they saw. Fix yourself before trying to fix others. Growing in virtue requires humility, not moral superiority. Distrusting showy virtue is also a way to avoid ethical arrogance, the need to correct others just to feel better about yourself or to look more righteous. In practice, Stoicism teaches an ethic of modesty, a steady path walked without flash. It reminds us that the real challenge of ethics isn't looking good, it's staying good when there are no guarantees, no rewards, and no applause. In times where visibility often replaces real value, the Stoics invite us to reconnect virtue with silence, to be good not because it will be seen, but because it's the right thing to do, and that, they say, is enough. In The Brothers Karamazov, one of Fyodor Dostoevsky's most intense and powerful works, there's a moment of deep philosophical and existential rupture, the monologue of Ivan Karamazov, a rational, clear-headed and tormented character who challenges the foundations of religious morality and even the very idea of faith. Ivan isn't a shallow atheist. He's not out to mock God or reject dogma just for fun. His criticism runs deeper. It's more painful, more tragic. He doesn't deny God's existence. He rejects a world where innocent suffering exists, especially when it comes to children. His famous line, "I respectfully return my ticket," sums up a crushing moral dilemma. If universal harmony requires the suffering of even one innocent child, Ivan wants no part in that harmony. He would rather live in rebellion than accept a cosmic order built on pain and injustice. His refusal isn't just emotional, it's an ethical protest against all forms of morality that treats suffering as a necessary cost for some greater good. Ivan asks hard questions with brutal clarity. Is it ever right to demand pain in the name of redemption? Can present evil be justified by a future promise of good? He calmly shares real cases of cruelty toward children, beatings, torture, abuse, and then asks his brother Alyosha, the most devout of the Karamazovs, imagine you could build the structure of human destiny on the suffering of one child. Would you agree to be the architect? This question hits at the heart of theodicy, the long-standing attempt in theology and philosophy to reconcile the existence of a good, all-powerful God with the existence of evil in the world. But Ivan isn't looking for answers. He's rejecting the whole logic of justification. To him, no moral system, no belief, no doctrine, no matter how noble, has the right to explain, excuse, or rationalize innocent suffering. Any system that tries to do so, he argues, is already corrupted by cold abstraction. So his critique is really aimed at the pious, those who accept suffering as part of a divine plan, those who comfort themselves with the idea that everything happens for a reason. Ivan sees that as a betrayal of real compassion, a kind of moral numbness that lets people endure the unbearable with cliches, dogma, and promises of a better afterlife. From that point on, Ivan's critique goes even deeper. He anticipates key questions from modern moral thought. Should ethics accept evil as something inevitable? Is it right to build morality on the hope of future rewards? Can any absolute value justify the sacrifice of the innocent? Ivan offers no comfort. What he offers is raw truth, an open wound, and a kind of clarity that offers no way out. His protest is both moral and metaphysical, and that makes it devastating. Because if we can no longer believe in a just higher order, then what's left? That's Ivan's anguish. His critique isn't cynical, it's deeply ethical. He doesn't want to destroy morality. He wants to purge it of any excuse for evil. And if that means giving up faith, then so be it. In the famous chapter, The Grand Inquisitor, Ivan pushes his critique even further. He imagines Jesus returning to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. When the people recognize him, he's arrested by the Grand Inquisitor, a powerful cardinal who tells Jesus that he'll be executed. Why? Because the church no longer needs his freedom or his truth. According to the Inquisitor, people don't want freedom. They want bread, safety, and miracles. And so, the church, in the name of the greater good, abandoned Christ's original message and replaced it with a more useful, controlled, institutionalized morality. Here, Ivan's attack on the pious reaches its peak. It's not just suffering that's at stake, but how suffering is managed, hidden, and justified by religious and political systems. Pious morality becomes a tool for control. Good becomes a way of organizing evil, dulling guilt, and maintaining order. What makes Ivan's critique even more painful is that he doesn't offer a solution. He doesn't have faith, but he's not a nihilist either. He doesn't believe in God, but he doesn't celebrate that. He's stuck at the edge, torn between the need for absolute justice and the impossibility of finding it in this world. That's what makes his protest so tragic. Dostoevsky never directly answers Ivan. His genius is in letting the question hang in the air. But by creating a character who refuses salvation built on the suffering of even one innocent soul, Dostoevsky forces us to ask, how often do we accept evil in the name of good? How often do we become too pious to see the horror right in front of us? Ivan's critique remains one of the most powerful in all of philosophy and literature, because it demands a kind of moral courage that most of us can't handle. The courage to not justify the unjustifiable. Émile Cioran isn't the kind of philosopher you turn to for comfort, easy answers, or feel-good ethics. His philosophy, poetic, sharp, and brutally honest, is a dive straight into the abyss of human existence, where suffering, boredom, nihilism, and absurdity aren't problems to solve, but truths to face head-on. Among his many unsettling ideas, one stands out: the strange similarity between the saint, who gives up the world in the name of spiritual purity, and the scoundrel, the cynic, the degenerate who spits on all illusions. Cioran plays with this thin line between the two, showing that deep down, both are driven by the same thing: a total disillusionment with life. In The Trouble with Being Born, he writes, "The saint and the scoundrel are both outsiders. One gives up the world because of too much purity, the other because of too much disgust. But both recognize the horror of living like everyone else." Cioran sees a dark truth in this parallel. The denial of life can come from a desire to rise above it, or from complete revulsion toward it. The saint rises above, the scoundrel crawls below, but both turn their backs. Both reject the social charade, fake virtues, and rituals of hope. One does it in the name of the sacred, the other in the name of the absurd. For Cioran, this paradox is a direct challenge to the very idea of meaning. If even sainthood can be seen as a form of deep disgust for life, then what's left of spiritual idealism? The line between purity and disillusionment, between faith and nihilism, starts to blur. And that's the tension Cioran explores so powerfully. He points out that the saint, admired for spiritual greatness, actually lives a form of radical rejection. They deny pleasure, give up connections, punish the body, suppress desire. But to Cioran, that's not just discipline, it's veiled aggression, a quiet, almost cruel rejection of ordinary life. Sainthood is a refined form of misanthropy, disguised as transcendence. The scoundrel, on the other hand, doesn't hide it. He hates the world openly, cynically, without the cover of virtue. But in the end, both live at odds with reality. Both reject mainstream values. Both live on the fringe, as silent or loud protests against the experience of being alive. This view is disturbing because it breaks down the usual moral hierarchy. Cioran won't let us feel good believing the saint is above and the scoundrel is below. He argues that both come from the same place: despair. The only difference is their style, not their substance. That's what makes Sioran's philosophy so corrosive. It doesn't just question religion, it unravels moral illusions too: good, evil, purity, sin. To Sioran, they're all just symptoms of the same disease: consciousness, the awareness that everything is absurd, the clarity that makes belief impossible but also refuses to forget. From this painful clarity, Sioran builds a unique kind of ethics. Not rules, but a tragic way of living. To him, living well isn't about adapting. It's about suffering with dignity. And that dignity can look like the silent meditation of a monk or the bitter sarcasm of an outsider. Both are ways of expressing the pain of being in a world that makes no sense. When Sioran mocks sainthood, he's not mocking faith itself. He's pushing it to its limits. He asks, what if saints aren't signs of divine love, but symptoms of cosmic exhaustion? What if spiritual purity isn't light, but the final emptiness that comes after all illusions have burned away? He's not trying to destroy spirituality. He's trying to expose its hidden motives. To Sioran, every search for transcendence carries a deep suspicion, the desire to escape the human condition. So what's the difference between a mystic and a nihilist? Maybe just the mask they wear. That idea is deeply unsettling, and that's the point. Sioran doesn't want to soothe you. He wants to wake you up. He wants you to look into the human soul with no filters. And what do we find? An abyss filled with fear, clarity, and a desperate urge to escape. For Sioran, philosophy isn't about building systems, it's about breathing through collapse. Philosophy becomes, in his own words, a funeral song for what can't be saved. So, in the end, he leaves us in an unstable place, somewhere between letting go and holding on, between the saint's silence and the scoundrel's laughter. Both are facing the same horror, the pain of existing without a reason. The saint tries to sublimate that pain, the scoundrel mocks it, but for Sioran, both are trapped by the same truth, that to live is to be unbearably aware. Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher known for his deep pessimism, was far from indifferent to morality. In fact, he was one of the few modern thinkers who believed that the true foundation of ethics isn't reason, religion, or social utility, but compassion, Mitleid. However, that compassion, far from being pure or heroic, is for Schopenhauer ambiguous, misleading, and even dangerous. His starting point is a tragic view of existence. The world is not a place of harmony or progress, but a battleground of blind wills locked in endless conflict. In this bleak setting, compassion appears as a rare exception to the rule of selfishness. It's a moment when we suspend our ego-driven impulses and recognize in someone else the same pain and life force that drives us. For a brief second, the veil of illusion lifts, and we act not out of self-interest, but from a shared sense of suffering. But Schopenhauer warns us, unless this compassion is grounded in clear understanding, it can easily turn into sentimentality, a misjudgment of reality, an illusion that clouds our view of what's really going on. He writes, compassion is the foundation of morality, but it is not, by itself, a guarantee of wisdom. Why not? Because compassion, while noble at its root, is also an unstable emotion. It can be easily misdirected, fooled by appearances, or distorted by emotion. We might feel sorry for those who fake weakness. We might be moved by false tears. We might act impulsively after seeing images of suffering without knowing the full context, what caused it, what consequences might follow. Even worse, we might fool ourselves into thinking that every kind act is automatically good, when, in truth, it could be enabling the very suffering we want to stop. This view puts Schopenhauer at odds with more optimistic views of morality. He rejects utilitarianism, which reduces morality to a calculation of pleasure and pain, and he also rejects Kant's rational duty-based ethics. For Schopenhauer, morality doesn't come from cold logic or social convenience. It comes from a dark intuition, that we are all suffering, and that, in rare moments, we can recognize someone else's pain as our own. But here's the catch. How often is that recognition real? Isn't compassion often just emotional projection? A failure to tell the difference between what's truly needed and what just seems touching? Schopenhauer warns that kindness based only on feelings is fragile, easy to deceive, and worse, easy to manipulate. Governments, religions, advertisements, and ideologies all know this. They use the emotional appeal of kindness to shut down critical thinking and shape behavior. We're pushed to do good because it feels right, not because we actually understand what's at stake. Sentimental kindness might lead us to act out of pity, but also out of guilt, pride, or fear. It can trap us in an image of ourselves as good people, while we overlook the damage our good intentions might cause. Here, Schopenhauer aligns with Buddhist thought, which he deeply admired. In Buddhism, true compassion only arises when the ego is transcended, when life is seen clearly as suffering, and the reaction isn't emotional panic, but calm and thoughtful action. In Schopenhauer's language, this is the denial of the will, when a person gives up their endless desires, recognizes life's absurdity, and acts with detachment, not emotional attachment. True kindness, then, isn't sentimental. It's tragic, quiet, and often invisible. This idea goes against the grain in today's world, where we value visible emotion, quick empathy, and public acts of charity. Schopenhauer, instead, calls for introspection, moral skepticism, and the uncomfortable question: is my kindness real, or just a way to avoid someone else's pain so I can feel better about myself? That question shakes the foundation of everyday morality, and in doing so, Schopenhauer doesn't make us cynical. He makes us more aware, more demanding, more alert to the gap between intention and outcome. Yes, his philosophy is pessimistic, because it sees suffering as the fabric of life, but it's also enlightening, because it offers an ethics without illusions, an ethics that demands deep perception, not just emotional reaction. One that honors compassionate acts, but only when they come from a radical awareness of universal pain, not from the vanity of appearing virtuous. For Schopenhauer, real kindness is rare, silent, and anonymous, and maybe that's exactly why it's the only kind that truly matters. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for taking the time to dive into this deep reflection. It's truly a privilege to share ideas that challenge, provoke, and maybe even change the way we see the world and ourselves. If this content resonated with you, if it moved you, made you think, or sparked a new question, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel reach more people who are also looking for this kind of thoughtful, philosophical content. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next lessons and reflections, always delivered with depth, clarity, and a touch of provocation. And of course, share this video with anyone you think might connect with these ideas, friends, study groups, or anyone who's open to thinking beyond the surface. Leave a comment down below too. I'd love to hear what you think. Whether you agree, disagree, or have suggestions for future topics, let's keep the conversation going. And don't leave just yet. There's a lot more content here on the channel waiting for you. Ethics, philosophy, existentialism, social, critique, and timeless reflections, all made with care and a genuine passion for thought. See you in the next video. Until then.